Hello, my name is Dr. Jeff Gunzel, and I am going to give you a quick overview of the first 9 functional, emotional, and developmental capacities. This short video is designed for folks that have just completed the developmental capacity section of the DIR 101 course. And the idea is to give you an analogy or an example of what these 9 developmental capacities look like. This is not a perfect analogy. I think anyone that is an expert in floor time that would watch this and see the analogy would have comments of, well, what about this, or what about that, or we should include this, or we should include that. These developmental capacities are much more complicated than this simple analogy can provide, but it can be a good way to bring together the things that you've learned in a kind of a logical analogy that can help synthesize your learning. The other part that I'll say before I go through this is the analogy is going to be kind of sequential, thinking about a young child moving through the developmental process. If you were going to look at this with an older child or an adult, there would be much more complexity to it, and it would look quite different than this analogy that I'm going to provide here. But let's get started and go through these 9 developmental capacities, thinking about how we play with a ball, and even some examples of what type of ball that we play with. So starting with functional emotional and developmental capacity, FEDC 1, regulation and interest in the world. When I think of a small child playing with a ball, when they're at capacity 1 and developing capacity 1, it's really around their sensory experience of the ball. So most likely the type of ball they're going to play with is a ball that they can hold in their 2 hands. Maybe it's a little bit squishy and it gives some sensory input, but it's about their sensory experience of the ball and maintaining their regulation while they're interested in that ball. And we want to see that develop and grow and be able to have longer and longer times where they can be there interested in that ball and maintain their regulation. Moving into capacity 2, engaging and relating, well, now that ball starts to be shared with someone else. So if it's a small child, maybe sharing it with mommy, we would probably have the same type of ball. It's not going to be a ball that bounces around a lot or things, and it's really going to be an intimate sharing of the ball. You start to see some flow back and forth. And then maybe all 4 hands are on the ball at the same time, or maybe it's in mommy's hands and then the child's hand. But it's a beginning of engaging and relating with another person. It's much more about being with the other person than the ball itself. I often talk about this capacity as being versus doing. It's much more about the being. Yes, you may be doing something, but it's much more about the being with someone else. And then move into capacity 3, intentionality and two-way communication. Well, in thinking about how we play with that ball, now we actually will have a little more distance between the child and mom, continuing with the example. And maybe it's not that little squishy ball. Maybe it's a ball that rolls a little bit better. It's not going to be a super bouncy ball, but it would support a little more distance. You're not going to see a huge distance, but the ball start to be tossed back and forth or rolled back and forth. And if we think about communication, because this analogy is analogy representing the broader development. If we think about communication, communication will be very similar. The child may intentionally open circles of communication and be in some back and forth communication, but the distance in many ways would need to be pretty close, well supported, and the communication is going to be fairly simple. And it's the same with playing with the ball. The child may intentionally bring the ball to mommy and want to play with mommy and be in some back and forth, but maybe after 4 or 5 back and forth exchanges with the ball, they go off and exit and go do something else, and then they come back, much like we would see with circles of communication as capacity 3 is developing. Well, then we get to capacity 4, complex communication and shared problem solving. Everything in playing with that ball starts to become more and more complex. So now the child could play with that super bouncy ball that's going to bounce all over the place because they're able to be in a more complicated, complex interaction with that ball. And the distance can be much greater. We could be across the room from each other, and the ball is bouncing all over the place. And again, if you think about it as communication, the distance in some respects could be greater. The communication could bounce all over the place, maybe even bounce outside of the room, so to speak, using the ball analogy. The child can go get it and come back and still be in it. And so we see much more complexity, much more elaborate ways that that ball is going to be played with. But maybe that super bouncy ball bounces and hits the ceiling really close to the light, and the child and mom look up at the light and they're like, "Oh, we're afraid we're going to break the light." And so together, they're going to problem solve what they're going to do. And they're going to come up with ideas. And the child might say, "Well, maybe we can go outside and play." And so they decide to go outside and play with the ball because that's a brilliant idea. And mommy thinks that's a good idea too. But then they get outside and the grass is still wet from raining earlier in the day. And so they have to come up with a plan B, a different idea, but together they're working on that shared problem solving. And it is less about the problem of the ball hitting the light and much more about the shared problem solving aspect, that they're in it with someone else figuring it out. And then we go to capacity 5, using symbols and creating emotional ideas. Well, now the ball doesn't have to be a ball anymore. Maybe we have a big medicine ball and it's a world, and there's dinosaurs that the child is pretending are there, and one dinosaur is angry at the other dinosaur, and there's emotion involved in the ideas. But there really aren't any rules around what those ideas are. It's just kind of a lots of ideas coming creative in a creative way from the child and full of emotion. We can see all sorts of play, pretend play happening at earlier developmental capacities, but capacity 5 is where you really get the emotionality attached to it. And it's really more organic ideas from the child and their experiences and how they're building emotion into it. And then we get to capacity 6, the logical thinking and building bridges between ideas. Well, now playing with that globe, that medicine ball, that's a world. Now there could be multiple worlds and how those worlds interact with each other. And you could have, different stories on each world, but then able to bring those logical ideas together about how the stories really can come together. It's like watching a good movie. You may be partway sitting in the theater, partway through the movie, wondering, what about this subplot? Why is this happening? And why is that happening? And I don't see how it connects. But then as the movie goes, you start to realize, oh, that's why they had this happening. And it all does connect in a logical way. And that's what Dr. Greenspan was talking about with the logical thinking and building bridges between ideas. I think the word logical confuses people sometimes because kids will play in a logical way at their earlier developmental capacities. They'll play with the way the toy this is supposed to be played and things like that. But what we're talking about logical here, capacity 6, is that there's reasoning behind it. There's reasoning why that dinosaur is angry at the other dinosaur, and really gets into the logic behind it, and able to have multiple things going on that logically interconnect. And then we get to capacity 7, multiple perspectives. I'm going to switch to children playing the game of soccer. When children are playing with a soccer ball and they're playing on a team in a game of soccer, prior to capacity 7, they really struggle playing positions. They'll be like this group of kids following the ball around. But at capacity 7, when they really start to see that the perspective of the other players in other positions and how they see the field and how they see the game playing with that soccer ball, they can see those ideas, and then that impacts the way that they're going to play their position, and they can see how the game comes together much more when they get those multiple perspectives. Going on to the gray area thinking at capacity 8, maybe 90% of the time they play their position in a certain section of the field, but technically they could go farther out from where they normally play. And in that 10% of the time, the nuance of things, there's certain situations that may happen where they do something quite different than their position normally would be. Them to be able to engage in that 10%, or whatever percentage it is, I'm making up a number, but for them to be able to engage in that gray area, they need to be able to have that gray area thinking, that it's not just I'm playing my position or I'm not playing my position. There's gray area and there's nuance to it. And so they start to be able to engage in that. And then capacity 9, reflective thinking and an internal standard of self. Maybe when they were playing that soccer game in a capacity 8, they started getting the gray area thinking and they started to realize they could stretch the rules and do things a little different. Maybe they started to cheat a little bit and started to realize they could get away with certain things. And if they did, they would get an advantage over someone else. But at capacity 9, they developed the capacity to be able to reflect on that and reflect that reflective thinking and maybe comparing what they did to what another child on the field is doing. And they might think to themselves, maybe cheating is okay for Johnny, but I don't like to be a cheater. That's not who I am. And that builds that internal standard of self. Again, this is a quick analogy on how we play with a ball and tying it to these 9 developmental capacities. There is much more to each of these developmental capacities, but I hope this helps give you an example to pull together what you've learned about these first 9 developmental capacities. Thank you.